Good evening. I'd like to call our meeting to the meeting of the Education Committee together at 4:01. Call it to order on March 2nd, 2022. Good, and I'd like to acknowledge that with great respect and humility, we acknowledge the lands of the Siniima people. The Siniima people maintain their profound, unique, and spiritual connections to the land through ageless traditions, teaching, stewardship, and expressions of reciprocity. And I also want to acknowledge our Siniima, our Sinawas and Sinimas families, as well as our families from the Métis Nations as we start tonight. Are there any additions, deletions, or changes in order to tonight's meeting? Seeing none, I seek a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Moved by Jessica, Trustee Stanley, and seconded by Greg. Thank you. Having approved the agenda, I seek a motion to approve the minutes of the Education Committee meeting held February 2nd, 2022. Trustee Higginson and Stanley. Thank you. We have no presentations from the public tonight. We do have reports from senior staff. I'd like to call upon Tim Davey, our Deputy Superintendent, as well as the head of the Department of Learning Services. We're going to be having two reports tonight on the broad issue of assessment and reporting. We'll be looking at our adult Dogwood and our How Are We Doing reports. And I'm going to ask that we hold our questions till after both of these topics are addressed, so that we make sure our presenters have the time that they need. Just a reminder that we have our business committee meeting at 6 o'clock. So my hope is we can wrap up tonight around 4:45, 4:50 at the latest, so people have time to stretch and just have a little break between our two meetings. And if somehow we don't get a chance to cover everything we want to tonight, I've spoken to Chair McKay and to the superintendent and Mr. Davey, and we will make sure that we find a way, we bring these topics back for further discussion. And we think a lot of these matters will come up in other reports over the remainder of the school year. So, yeah. So no concerns. Don't want anyone to worry if they think if their questions don't get answered tonight. We will get you the answers that you're searching for. So, Mr. Davey, I will hand it over to you.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to first acknowledge and welcome Joan Brown, who's also known as Auntie Joan. Auntie Joan is CAO with Siniima First Nation, and also knowledge keeper and dear friend to the district. Provides us with guidance and wisdom, and I'm just very appreciative of Joan being here this evening to join our presenters. It's also my pleasure to present to you Assistant Superintendent Don Balcom and Director of Instruction Ricky Bartlett, who will be sharing tonight's presentation with you. And just for the committee, please know that the rest of the Department of Learning Services team is here to be able to step in and answer questions at the end as well. So I'll turn it over to Auntie Joan, Ricky Bartlett, and Don Balcom. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Davey, and I'm going to get us started, and I also extend appreciations to Karen Matthews, who's going to be running our slides for us as we go through the presentation this evening. So thank you, Chair, for this honor. We're happy to have a conversation this afternoon related to our school completion rates and the How Are We Doing report from the ministry. In the past, we have spoken about satellite, map, and street data. The ministry provides school districts with completion rates relative to the provincial average, as well as data that is year over year. The ministry's How Are We Doing report shares data on completion rates, as well as data on FSA results, specific course completion rates, and student learning survey results for our Indigenous learners. These are clearly sets of satellite data, high-level view of how the system is performing, and we're happy at the end of this presentation to have a deeper conversation around the topics of completion rates and the How Are We Doing report. Next slide, please, Karen. We're reminded by the author and speaker Thomas King that the truth about stories is that's all we are. I love that quote because I'm a big fan of stories, and I'm really happy this year that we get a chance to talk a bit of an educational story about our completion rates and our how we're doing reports. It's important that we do tell our stories and that we tell them frequently. As a listener, we often learn new things each time we hear a story, even if that story itself sounds familiar. Today's story is a glimpse into a 50-year window of a much longer story. We're somewhere in the middle of this much longer story. It's important that we be careful also how we tell our stories. This story is about school completion, about graduation. It is also a story about success or the absence of success. And we need to be careful how we tell stories of success, as it is complicated. What defines success? Who decides on those definitions? The Ministry of Education defines success in part by the number of students who successfully complete school by their standards. This is not the only definition of success, for there are many examples of students who have indeed completed school who would claim that their own schooling experience was anything but a success. There are also countless examples of those students who did not complete school who would proclaim their schooling experience to be very successful. Our school system in British Columbia is a colonial construct. We have a Eurocentric orientation in our structures and processes, from our school buildings to our groupings of students to our curricular organizations. Definitions of success by that system are also colonial. Completion rates in our system are an indicator of success. It is important that we consider multiple definitions of student success when examining our practices and exploring interventions and strategies to ensure more and more students have positive learning outcomes. Next slide, please, Karen. Our Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools vision, mission, values, and goals. This is what is important to Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools today in 2020. This vision, the mission, the values, and our goals are how we situate ourselves in our work today and moving forward. Next slide, please, Karen. We're very fortunate in this time here to have our CIETSIS framework in place. It helps us broaden our definition of success. It provides space to walk together on our path to reconciliation. Next slide. Our commitments to truth and reconciliation as a district also gives permission and encourages us to embrace First Peoples principles of learning. I've pulled out a few that I think will be part of our story today. That learning is holistic and it's relational. It's focused on the connectedness, on reciprocal relationships, and that sense of place. Learning also involves generational roles and responsibilities, and we'll be talking about generations this afternoon. And of course, learning is embedded in memory, in history, and in story. And so it is appropriate today that we tell our story of school completion. Next slide, please. We pulled some data into the package for trustees, and there's of course a lot more data available to us through the ministry's reports on school completion, as well as on the How Are We Doing report, which is a lengthy report running approximately 55 pages. The two graphs that I'm going to speak to right now show us our completion rates from the years 2002 through to last year, 2021. For the slide 6 shows our Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners completion rates over those years, and slide 7, next slide, Karen, please, shows the non-special needs and our special needs students completion rates over that same period of time from 2002 through 2021, and that will be the basis for the first part of our story. Next slide, please, Karen. Our story today starts not at the beginning of the story, but somewhere in the middle. It starts back in 1984. Our graduating class of 2002, which is that first data point on slide 6 and slide 7, were born back in 1984, which also happened to coincide with the last year that a residential school in BC was closed, or the last residential school in BC was closed. In 1984, those parents of those newborns had their own story of their educational journey, as did their parents and the parents of those parents. But for today, our story does not go back that far. We begin in 1984 with those students who joined the schooling system with us in the September of 1989. And what was happening for those students when they entered kindergarten? What were the hopes and dreams for those students? Most likely, like many parents, there was no desire to have their children have a slightly better life than their own, that their experiences at school would be more positive and more supportive than their own had been, that their outcomes of schooling would be a bit better, that their life prospects would be a bit broader. 13 years later, the completion rate for the 2001-2002 school year was 80% for non-Indigenous students and 38% for our Indigenous learners. For students with special needs, 29% completion rate. In 2002, the gap between completion rates for our Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners was 42%. What did that 13-year journey for 1989 to 2002 look like? What did it sound like? What did it feel like? What was happening in those schools for those learners? Why did that journey end short for so many of those Indigenous students and students with special needs? The students who entered kindergarten all those years ago will be turning 38 years old this year. Many of them will have children of their own attending schools throughout NLPS. Some of those children, of those students who entered school so many years ago, will be entering kindergarten themselves. They will have entered this past September, and they will be completing their 13 years of schooling in 2034. So we pick up in the middle of our story back in 1984, and we'll today take it as far as 2034, a small 50-year window of a learning journey. Next slide, please, Karen. Since 2002, when those students born in 1984 finished school, several significant events have helped shape education. Some of those national, some provincial, and some very local. The United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous People, the UNDRIP, was signed in September 13th of 2007, which recognized the rights of Indigenous peoples throughout the world. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established in 2008, and in 2015, an over 500-page executive summary of its findings was released, along with 94 calls to actions. The Commission concluded that the Indian residential school system amounted to cultural genocide, and we are only 7 years into the findings of that commission, so the work is just beginning. And 150 years of residential school, the last one closing in 1984. In 1988, a Legacy for Learners report was released by the BC Royal Commission on Education, and in that 1988 report, they identified the need to make school relevant to Indigenous learners, to provide equitable funding, to reduce racial bias, to increase teacher knowledge of Indigenous culture, history, and languages. And in 1992, the First Nations Education Steering Committee was established, FNESC, which to this day provides educational advice to systems throughout the province. The Tripartite Education Framework Agreement from 2012 to 2018 played a significant role in embedding Aboriginal worldviews and perspectives throughout the K-12 curriculum, and is an integral part of our revised curriculum that students are learning with today. Locally, the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public School began work on the SIATSA reconciliation policy and framework and established a strategic goal of truth and reconciliation. These are large steps towards improving life chances for students. Next slide, Karen, please. Schools and classrooms in Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools between 2002 and 2021 began to look, sound, and feel different. Our completion rates are a reflection of those changes. Students who entered kindergarten in 2008 walked into different schools than the ones that our graduating class of 2002 did. The classrooms, the connections, the supports in place during their journey have resulted in improved life chances for our 2021 graduates. The shifts often occur slowly over time, not always noticeable when viewed through a narrow lens. With a broader perspective, these results come into focus more dramatically. A 42% increase in completion rates of Indigenous learners and a 35% increase in completion rates for students with special needs is something our district should be very proud of. We need to pause and reflect on the hard work and dedication of everyone who has had a part in that success, while always looking for ways to meet the needs of even more students. Next slide, please. The changes that are occurring now will influence our completion rates this year, in 2 years, in 5 years, and 13 years for the class of 2034, our current cohort of kindergarten students. Before they complete school, additional changes that we've not even imagined will become commonplace in the learning experiences of those students. Our system continues to get better at meeting the needs of our learners, and we will continue that trajectory. Next slide, please. I want to remind us how fortunate we are that we live in a country and a province and a community where we have such a high-performing education system. High-performing education systems around the world are defined by having a combination of excellence of outcomes, but also equity. We have highly qualified teachers, we have high outcomes throughout our system, and we have similar outcomes across our system, unlike some systems where they have pockets of excellence with very little equity, or they have equity across the system, but with poor outcomes. Next slide, please. There are many next steps. One of our next steps is to focus in a little bit more on our adult graduation diploma rates. We celebrate every adult graduation diploma recipient, as we should. Many of our adult Dogwood diploma recipients are the first graduate in their family, or they've had a life circumstance that has taken them off the pathway to graduation and have found their way back onto it, whether they're 19, 20, 40, 50 years old, and we celebrate them when we raise the hands to them and the families that have got them there. We also know, though, that our Indigenous learners are overrepresented in our adult graduation diploma rates. Our Indigenous students are also underrepresented in our academic courses that lead directly to some post-secondary programs. Our Indigenous learners completing school with an adult Dogwood diploma often do so through our Learning Alternatives program, having not experienced success at their neighborhood school. And we know there's work to do to support those learners and those schools. From curriculum pinch points to connecting students to land, language, and culture, to ensuring education is more holistic and relational, we will support more and more learners to remain on the pathway to graduation. We will continue to emphasize the importance of connecting learning to the land, the culture, and the language, and we will all benefit from a commitment to making learning more holistic, more experiential, more relational. And now I will turn the story over to Director Bartlett.
Hi, Don. Hi, Squale. It's an honor to be here this afternoon to talk with you about our thoughts on the How Are We Doing report, and specifically our Indigenous grad rates last year and our overall adult Dogwood rates among our Indigenous learners here in NLPS. Our Indigenous grad rates last year, as you know, and as Assistant Superintendent Balcom pointed out, were 80%, which is the highest our district has seen. And when we see a significant jump like this from 69% in the previous year to 80% last year, of course we analyze the why and the how so that we can continue to keep trending in this direction. I almost feel like when we see a significant jump like this, it naturally makes us question the other way at first. What are we missing? Did we do something wrong? And that just isn't the case. There's just so much to celebrate here, and I hope that all of you have taken time to do just that. I think before we look at what was unique to last year, it's important to recognize that for the past few years, this district and this board has been leading with intention around truth and reconciliation. From the dedication of you, the Board of Trustees, and our senior team's commitment in leading this work, the depth of relationships that have strengthened with our surrounding nations, the work being done with the Sayetsis family and Natsmat Tadalat, all that focus, all that dedication, all that commitment is really coming through for our Indigenous learners, and I believe we will continue to see graduation rates rise in our district because of it. In analyzing what was unique to last year, we recognized that we offered very unique opportunities for outreach that we didn't previously offer on such a large scale. We had the opportunity through funding to create outreach positions with very intentional motivation to find creative ways and learning opportunities for students to show their success and demonstrate their learning without walking in through our doors of our school buildings. So offering students online learning platforms through Google Classroom with a supportive teacher who they had a previous relationship with really allowed students to successfully engage in online learning and a virtual environment. Sorry. As a principal, I saw students who weren't previously successful in online learning programs who were showing success, and we believe that it was directly connected to that social emotional piece that we could offer with these outreach programs being connected to our school staffs. And of course, all hands on deck with students being supported with technology to remove that barrier, we believe also helped in their opportunity for success. For our students who preferred to engage in a more project-based approach to learning, we had our outreach teachers creating project-based materials for them to show their learning. It was common practice for these teachers or support workers to be dropping off materials at their homes, books, resources, science lab materials, package-based work, boxes of food with recipes for food course credits, canvases with art supplies. We even had PE teachers creating personalized workout programs for students so they could log their physical activity. And many teachers were meeting students off-site, going for walks, going for hikes, even shooting hoops at parks. And then of course, staff just reaching out to say hi, making a connection, telling students that we miss them and we care about them, and just reaching out for a check-in. So recognizing this unique opportunity and seeing the success it offered our students, the conversations in preparation for this school year were to try to sustain a level of that programming. I know Don has a secondary outreach team he meets with regularly, but from an Indigenous learning lens, we really saw a need to support students who were starting the year this September, still not quite ready to return. And honestly, many students who have always needed these types of opportunities. So how could we make that work? Next slide, please, Karen. So we have Indigenous support teachers at all of our secondary schools in our district who hold less than a 1.0 FTE for Indigenous support for as long as I can remember. So we collaborated with our Leaders for Learning and decided that we would spend our surplus dollars to increase all the FTE for all of these Indigenous support teachers across the district so that they all held a 1.0. So what this did is it created the flexibility in these roles to do outreach and really work intimately with students and families using a personalized approach to support their learning. With this increased support, we hope it will help in grad rates staying strong and continuing to increase for our Indigenous learners. Next slide. Adult dogwoods. Next slide. There we go. Adult dogwoods, the hot topic. So the number of Indigenous learners who have graduated with an adult dogwood has increased over the past 5 years. In the 2016-2017 school year, 10% of our Indigenous learners graduated with an adult dogwood, with a steady increase to 18% this past year. So what does it mean to attain an adult dogwood? Well, it generally means that either those students have been continually unsuccessful in completing their grad program courses in their grade 10 and 11 years and lack the number of credits to attain a regular dogwood as they approach grade 12. Or they haven't been in school during those years and are returning in their grade 12 year wanting to graduate so they can move on to other aspirations. So we ask ourselves why? What's going on for those learners during those years that cause them to disengage or to not engage at all? Next slide, please, Karen. There are many reasons why students disengage in school, especially our Indigenous learners, generational trauma, various family situations, poverty is a big one, students having to drop out for a year or two, having to join the workforce to help support their family household. in a time where parents have lost a job. Fear of COVID has been obviously a big one in the last couple of years. Fear reignited with the findings of the children at the residential school sites. And then, of course, just not being engaged in what school has to offer, where students' core values aren't reflected in what school looks like and feels like for them. I also believe that we have a new barrier happening across our system with the divided culture that this pandemic has brought with it. Many students are surrounded by a set of values and beliefs in their homes and on social media that look much different from those values and beliefs that they see and hear and feel at school. And those are, those things are really hard for children to navigate. Next slide, Karen. But how do we know what's going on for each individual learner? This year we have 2,596 Indigenous students attending 35 school sites within NLPS, 249 on-reserve students, 838 students living off reserve, 844 non-status learners, 642 Métis and 38 Inuit students. So as a system, how do we know what's going on for each learner? Because once we attain this data that we're talking about this afternoon, it's too late for some of our students. From an Indigenous learning lens, we focus on our students. We focus on supporting our students continuously throughout the year, whether they're in school or not. And we do this by using the red, yellow, green document to guide us. For those of you that aren't familiar, the red, yellow, green document is our way of receiving information in the fall, winter, and spring from schools about how students are doing in areas such as attendance, engagement levels, course completion, and social emotional health and well-being. And then when we receive these documents from our Indigenous support teams, we use them to guide our conversations about where to go next. So green would represent students excelling in all or most areas. Yellow would mean that a student is perhaps struggling with something, but the Indigenous support team at the school site feels that they have the capacity and resources to continue working within their team to support that student. And the red would determine that we would meet about these students more intimately, bringing in additional supports to wrap around those learners from a community perspective. Giving them all of our love and attention. For students who attend our schools and reside on our 3 nations, we use the red, yellow, green to regularly collaborate with our education representatives from the nations and our Indigenous partners to put plans of support in place collectively for these students. We have also heard that there will be an opportunity in the near future for our nations to request specific information around success rates for our Indigenous, for our on-reserve Indigenous students from the ministry. We haven't had the opportunity to talk about this yet with our Leaders for Learning, but it'll be good conversation. But the beautiful thing about the red, yellow, green document is that it's live, and we can work with it throughout the year with our surrounding nations in an attempt to change the stories of some of our learners in the moment. What else? Yeah, I think our relationship with our nations and our education reps is just so important. They're the ones that have the intimate information about our students and families that we need to help us create plans that are meaningful. They're the ones that are able to help us in answering some of the questions that we need to know to know how to wrap around students meaningfully. Next slide, Karen. Excuse me. So once we know what's happening for our students in red, we look at taking action steps. So some examples I provided here tonight are personalized learning opportunities. Which of these students are in the workforce? Which type of work are they doing? Could we support these students with a specialized program such as CTC? Or perhaps over the course of a semester, we can find a cluster of courses that students are able to attain credits for during a period of time. And then when they're able to return to school, they're in a position to graduate with a regular Dogwood or not be so far behind their peers. So for example, courses such as work experience, are our Indigenous students working for their nation communities? Could we bridge them with a cultural leadership credit? Are they out fishing and hunting, and could they attain a cultural outdoor education credit for their hours spent in that meaningful learning? Are they helping take care of family members, elders, younger siblings? And could we provide them with a family studies, child development, or peer tutoring type credit? And so the red, yellow, green document really gives us that street data that we need to collaborate, find the most supportive approach for our learners, and act. Bridging student success when students aren't within the physical school environment can feel challenging for many school staff. You know, not being there to watch students in their learning for some teachers is really difficult. But we remind them that it's not about lowering our expectations of students, but honoring them for where they're at that particular time in their journey, and really just trying to find ways to connect their learning to the curriculum. Sometimes it's the support students need to really get to the other side of whatever it is they're going through, and providing them these creative options allows them the confidence in coming back to school, not feeling so behind their peers. So I also wanted to highlight how important it is for us to give these students and families the dignity they deserve in advocating for themselves in what they need during these certain times. And it's also good for us to remember that learning doesn't stop when they leave our school buildings. Students build knowledge and capacity and resilience within their own communities as well. And on the other side of that, as we look inward, it's just as important for us to continue the work in schools and within our system to improve environments for our Indigenous learners. So decolonizing school environments, immersing Indigenous curriculum into the classrooms. I found it so interesting on the How Are We Doing report that almost every single Indigenous student who took a First Peoples themed course succeeded in that course. BC First Peoples 12, 100% success rate. Contemporary Indigenous Studies, 100% success rate. Hulkaminam Land and Language Programs, 100% success rate. English First Peoples 12, 100% success rate. English First Peoples 10, 88% this year, and I believe 93 the year before success rate. So what that tells us is that when Indigenous learners can see themselves in their learning, they succeed. And so what we need to do now is fill our school timetables with all of these courses and fill up those classes with all students. And we have some ideas about that we're talking around the table about. But because we know what is good for Indigenous learners is really good for all learners. And so really excited to further the conversation on that. And I think recognizing the biggest barriers for our Indigenous students. The ministry and FNESC reported at the JCAM meeting this fall that Science 10 is one of the single biggest barriers for Indigenous learners to stay on path for a regular Dogwood, and grade 10 in general. Also interesting to see on the student satisfaction survey, grade 10 is when students reported the lowest rate of feeling that they have two adults in the building who care about them. So interesting. And you know, I reflected about that as a school administrator. And there's always seemed to be grade 8 transition groups. A lot of focus with that grade 7 to grade 8 transition. Grade 9 connection groups, because we all recognize that grade 9 is a fiercely difficult year for so many of our grade 9 students. And then in grade 10, we just kind of really expect them to be leaders, and they're on the grad program, and we just expect this independence. And when we hear that it's considered a big, one of the biggest barriers for our Indigenous learners, we really, I'm just really fired up and excited to start looking deeper into the supports around literacy and numeracy at the grade 8 and 9 level, and how we're supporting students in those years to be grad program ready. And really treating grade 10 as a transition. That transition, wrapping around students for that transition, just like we do from the grade 7 to grade 8 transition, I think is really important. So, And how are we working with science and math teachers to bring an Indigenous perspectives and cultural ways of knowing into a course that is historically very colonial in its way of teachings, you know, so we can help break down those barriers in those course areas for those students. What else? Land and language. We have been working with language teachers in revisioning our language program with a vision of language revitalization and welcoming immersed environments, focusing on less schools with our biggest on-reserve populations. Really trying to immerse those schools in language and culture. We currently have 7 Hulkaminam teachers and a couple more on the horizon. So language teachers are really excited about that, being able to have a school to call home. You know, it's been really important for them to form relationships with students and staff and really bring that immersed culture through language into the school buildings. And looking to also expand the land and language program at LSS next year, creating a full year course offering for students. We're just in initial conversations with the team over there, but very excited about that, and also excited about expanding land and language at John Barsby and potentially into another school, just focusing on getting the right staffing in place. And then, of course, focusing on early intervention, as Superintendent Saywell stated in our February meeting. If we had $1, we would spend 90 cents of it in early learning interventions. And Assistant Superintendent Tate spoke at length around the support in our elementary realm, and most specifically our focus schools, around additional staffing to support literacy in the K to 3 years. Knowing that there's such a strong relationship between a child's ability to read by the end of grade 3 and graduation. So really trying to continue our focus on those early years with intentional supports. And then last but not least, continuing to build that collective responsibility. Just really working on bringing all the learning and leading the district has done over the past 4 years with Truth and Reconciliation, the SAYETSIS framework, the work of Natsmat Tadalat, and really work at getting all of that into the classrooms and building that collective responsibility, fostering our principals and vice principals to lead the work, our teachers to teach the work, and so we can have our students breathing the work. With Squale that Auntie Joan teaches us in leading with a good heart and a good mind. And so I'm really excited about moving forward. This data has fired up the team, and yeah, thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Auntie Joan herself. Are you there, Auntie? There you are.
Yes.
There you are.
Here I am. Hi, Tabka Siemensia. I couldn't see Lamnala. Really very humbled to be part of this story. As you know, our story began many, many years ago. And I think about how fortunate we are in terms of measuring true success. Is that how is it that we're moving away and finding a path forward where we can restore and recover what we've been lost many hundred years ago. In my heart and my mind, I'm so grateful to work with such a fabulous team, both at the leadership level and at the staff level. The commitment in my heart and my mind is really unmatched. When we think about the context of what we have to move forward, is we're at a place of it's really a critical junction. What we talked about earlier was the success in terms of graduating from an academic lens. From our perspective, is there's something more at stake and a way of being that potentially is on the brink of extinction. So for us, what I really admire and so proud to be part of a conversation where we're moving from recognizing that the graduation rates is important, but we also talk about what's the urgent work. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, we talk about reconciling with the land. We said in the beginning with the Siemensia family, our family takes the land in a community to raise a child. I don't know many other school districts who are really changing our focus to the land, understanding that if we don't restore and reclaim the land into her natural state, we'll have nothing left. In addition, I think about the organization itself, how we're moving away from, and those of you that know me, I'm really uncomfortable with categorizing us in a way that putting us in different silos. What we say, as the old people say, as the land says, we're all one family. So it's important to start measuring from a different perspective. It's hard to measure these major shifts because this is foundational work that we're setting in terms of restoring a way of being with the land. And I think that our first and foremost, we're beginning to think about education as part of a larger system. And to me, that's so important because we think about to learn is to heal and to heal is to learn. That's sort of the jump off point from the Siemensia framework into the Longhouse healing framework that was accepted by the school board a few months back. In my mind, those are critical things that we need to start measuring because it's a story that others should really begin to follow. I'm always anxious to hear when, you know, the school district leadership, they travel out and start telling our story because I think most people won't understand how much work it's taken at every touch point to rethink how we're living and walking. For me, they think about the graduation rates. It's important, but it always doesn't secure success. I've had grandchildren that have succeeded, graduated, that I don't have today. There's other deeper issues that we're trying to restore. Speaking to the Squale, so they have the coping skills and the resiliency that was intended from the gift from the creator in the land, and the old people understood. That's what we're striving for, so that we're going to work together, walk together, so that the land is going to be restored and thrive again. In my mind, that's what we need to start measuring that level of success. We think about a co-governance model at Qualcomm's to Lakewood. We think about how many different times the leadership, both at the staff and at the governance level, have created space for the Indigenous voice, a way of being. To me, is very powerful, thinking about my ancestors, and we never had that opportunity to be invited to the table in such a meaningful way. We're not just talking about it, we're not just studying it, we're living, walking, and breathing in a way that the old people had left us, a way to be together. I think that if people begin to understand that and learn from how this beautiful school district operates, how powerful is that? To walk in two worlds. And as the old people would say, if we don't work together, we're not going to survive. How many people can truly say that we're really one family, striving to recover what's been lost? Most importantly, when we talk about truth and reconciliation, to stay in our truths, and Squale. That's our definition of wellness. And that's what we're trying to inspire others to walk differently. And there's such an appetite and a willingness to listen to what's different. That level of success, we have to find a way to start measuring, so that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, you recognize that you've lost something and you're going to really benefit from a way of being with each other, a way of the knowledge, true knowledge as the old people understood it. I can't think of another school district that's doing the same. And I've been in this business, as you hear me say many, many times, for the past 40 years. And it's the first time I've been brought to the table that truly an Indigenous voice is walking freely throughout the schools, but most importantly, we're all turning towards the land. So for that, I say, Hai Tabka Siemensia, Hai Tabka.
So thank you. Are you ready for questions, team? Okay. Do we have questions from anyone on the board or our partners? Hello. There we go. Trustee Higginson.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the information so far tonight. And I'm really humbled to be having this conversation with Auntie Joan present. I'm reminded, as we talked about decolonizing the education system in your presentation, Director of Instruction Bartlett, how colonizing it is to actually have a bunch of governors sitting around a table talking about students. And so I am actually deeply uncomfortable with the process, and I hope that we work on evolving our own ways to do this in a better way. So Auntie Joan, thank you for coming tonight to help us with this conversation. And I have a lot of questions actually just about the information, the How Are We Doing itself, and how we sort of utilize that information in our district in a way that helps us direct our resources. And one of the things that I thought was a really interesting piece of information in the How Are We Doing is on page 6 of How Are We Doing, and it's the number of like the percentage of Indigenous students that make up the population of a school. And I thought that was actually quite interesting information when I look at it, and I think that I wondered how that information impacts, like how do we use that? How do we use that particular piece of information? Does it impact how we make any decisions? And if so, what does it? And if not, is it a conversation that is worth having, or is it just, this is one of those fine lines you walk, you don't want to make different decisions, because to your point that you made earlier, Ricky, about, when we do well for Indigenous students, we do well for all students, and all students should be taking actually First Peoples English courses and First Peoples language courses. In fact, I think that's something we should think about. But I just wondered, how do we use that particular chart? Does it influence anything in our district?
I'm just bringing up the chart.
No.
I can't find it at the moment, but so you're asking if the number of Indigenous students in each school reflect the resources allocated to those schools.
Or just does it reflect on, I mean, not even resourcing, but does it influence anything?
So staffing, I would say, within Indigenous Learning, we have a certain amount of FTE allocated for secondary schools. Students with higher Indigenous enrollment would have Indigenous support teachers with a larger number, an increased number of FTE. So I think for our, bigger schools with larger Indigenous number of students, we would have teachers with a 0.714, for example. Where our smaller schools, like Cedar and Learning Alternatives, they would have a 0.6, that kind of thing. And then also with our ICSSWs, our Indigenous Cultural Student Support Workers, some schools would have 1, some schools would have 2. Yeah, so I would say yes, in staffing, there would definitely be a bit of a ratio. I'm not sure what that ratio is yet, but going through the staffing process this year, I'd probably be better to answer your question. Laura, would that be? I know Laura would probably know more than.
No, I think you've done a great job, Ricky. Thank you. I would also, as you mentioned a little earlier in your presentation, is just remember that we also focus a lot of extra funds to the focus schools, which serve a higher Indigenous population as well. We're very conscious about on-reserve populations in the focus schools as well.
Can I have a quick follow-up? Is that okay,
Yeah,
Chair?
ask you.
Sure, thanks. So thanks. Always good to hear about increased staffing levels. I'm wondering if it impacts, and this might be a question that nobody at this particular on this screen knows, and it might have to get back to me on it, but does it impact the type of professional learning or cultural opportunities that those teachers at that school would participate in? You know, I think about such a, you know, the amazing impact that having that these types of opportunities have on the culture of a school. And, you know, just hearing Auntie Joan talk about, you know, the importance of connecting with, you know, traditions of the land. So just wondering if it's something that also might influence professional learning at the school level, influence cultural opportunities at the school level, influence community programming at the school level, things like that.
Is it okay if I speak from our perspective?
Of course.
Thank you. We're Qualcomm is one of, you know, fortunate to be considered one of the focus schools, and it's hard to articulate in terms of how it's transforming not only what's being delivered in terms of cultural opportunities, but it's moving us away from a colonial way of thinking. When we look at the organization itself, when we think about the co-governance model, it's so unique that we're looking at the system. How can we make sure that we change the system so it's an organization, an organism that's living, thriving is an important aspect. And I don't think anybody has that opportunity when we think about core governance. You know, we have notions of collective designation that people wouldn't begin to understand that, you know, it's everybody has lost along the way. So we look at ways of reintroducing from, you know, several touch points. And for us, like the great opportunity coming out of the pandemic, we could really begin to understand. And I'm grateful that you, Stephanie, have an opportunity to know what it means when we talk about, we want to start talking to people Squalean, not the intellect, not the emotions, because that's what people need to learn from. So it's much deeper. And, you know, thinking about, it's not just a language, but it's make sure we're including a way of being. And not many people understand that, but this school district does. And so I can only speak from our lived experience at Qualcomm and how that they're thriving as a family, just as we are, and that there's an opportunity to revisit for every student that's there, not only the students, but the parents at inclusive approach. So it speaks volumes, this approach. So thank you for that question and giving us an opportunity to speak to some unique successes.
Tim, you wanted to add a comment?
Please, thank you. And yeah, Auntie Joan, thank you so much for your responses and reflection, and again, sharing with us your lived experiences as well as a community, and very appreciative to have this conversation with you here. Trustee Higginson, I think you raised a question around BC First Peoples English and a course there, and I had the pleasure on Monday of sitting in with the superintendent and board chair, along with other staff members in this secondary student forum, and we had feedback coming from 13 or 14 senior students from across our district here, and just a lot of, I was so impressed with the conversation and what they brought forward. But really what I wanted to share was a couple of comments that I wrote down here, and this was sort of resonated throughout the room here, that BC First Peoples English should be mandatory, was the comment that was coming forward. And what really struck me, and I wrote this down, was if we value it, why isn't it mandatory? So, you know, as Director of Instruction Bartlett has pointed out here, Ricky, you stated that enough evidence for us that when students, Indigenous students are reflected in the coursework that they're learning about and talking about and discussing, and all of those fantastic pieces in terms of their own knowledge and growth that you've shared with us, the data around their success rates. And I think that's reflective here through this type of coursework. So I agree with your comment, Trustee Higginson. Why isn't this something that we're looking at and bringing, making mandatory across the district? And I'll go back to this group of students who have put this forward. So again, I was honored to be part of that discussion, and I think it is something that we should consider very seriously here. So thank you.
I would agree with that. Now, Ricky, I see you have a comment, so I'll let you make your comment, then I have a question.
Thank you. I was going to comment just as the Deputy Superintendent did. Lots of conversation in the district right now around incorporating English First Peoples 10 as the only option at all high schools. It's feeling like a big jump for people. We did it at ND last year, so this school year we will have every grade 10 student at NDSS who will have taken the English First Peoples 10 course as the English option. So really excited to see the How Are We Doing report next year with a lot more of our Indigenous and non-Indigenous students taking that course and kind of seeing where things lie. But definitely something that we are looking at bringing to the district in general. So thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie, I'll get to you in a sec. Stephanie, I was going to ask you, do you have any other questions in this sort of area?
I have so many questions, so we'll just let Jessica go, and we'll just have a
I have a question.
Conversation tonight. Thanks.
In line with this topic, Jessica, if you don't mind. What would it how complicated is it to make a course like that mandatory, like the English 10? Is it a consultation process? Is it like, how did NDSS do it?
So at NDSS last year, the year previous to this year, just lots of conversations with staff, getting a core number of English teachers on board and excited about it, giving them some release time to dive into the curriculum and get to know it. New is challenging, new is hard, and so just really giving teachers the time to dive in and have a network of people that they can use as support systems throughout, just doing something new for the first time. So not difficult. I think that if we did something like a system-wide across the district for English First Peoples 10, other than resources and providing teachers with that time, it wouldn't be difficult. We're talking about, with the coordinators, of putting a workshop together in late May this year, pulling together 2 English teachers per secondary school, and really working with bringing in knowledge keepers and our nation representatives and working with the teachers at breaking down the barriers that they hold and the fear that they hold for teaching that course. I think with everything with Truth and Reconciliation, there's so much emotion attached to the topic, and so a lot of fear, and so just really supporting those teachers and wrapping around them and making sure that they have a network of support, to make it successful.
Thank you. Thank you. Jessica, Trustee Stanley has a question. Jessica, you're having audio issues. You're squeaking again, my friend. Oh. Oops. Okay, so. All right, so Trustee Stanley had to step away because she's having issues. Are there other questions? Stephanie, I'll let you come up while we see if Jess can fix her computer.
Honestly, I can't stop laughing though.
I know.
It's okay for all of us.
Okay, am I back?
Oh, you're back.
At Jessica's.
Funny, Dale, thanks.
Okay.
Just for people who can't see the chat, a chipmunk was just put up in the chat, and I will somehow work that into a Halloween costume. Okay, may I go? I was saying, thanking everyone for the conversation and the presentation and the information, and to be honest, I'm having a hard time formulating my or even articulating my question because I'm trying to pay attention to the conversation here. So forgive me while I try to cobble this together because I don't quite have eloquent words to ask this, but I want to. And I'm going to start off with a lesson that has always very much stuck with me in a gut way, and that was Brad Baker in North Vancouver talked to us about the racism of low expectations with regards to Indigenous students. And that has never, that phrase has never left me. And it's always in the background and how I'm thinking about things. So not meaning to imply that that is what's happening, but I always want to view things from that lens. And when I look at, you know, it was in the conversation of talking about students, and I know we've done a lot of work for all students in finding ways to recognize their experience and their knowledge in their life experience. So finding credits from their skills was a conversation we were having. And I just want to know how it is we balance kind of that desire to recognize, you know, kind of formally the skills that they already have with kind of the other perspective of, you know, education, public education is intended to lift people out from, or at least provide an equal opportunity, you know, in ideal perspectives, but equal opportunity to lift people out of their, you know, oftentimes circumstances when it comes to poverty. And so I'm wondering how we balance the work that we do in encouraging people to perhaps have some, you know, achievements that might lead to success in our societal structure that we have currently, with that other goal of trying to recognize the skills they already have. And if I can add something even more complicated, when I look at the rates of Indigenous students in different types of the maths that we have, in our How Are We Doing report, and the maths that lead to university and the maths that don't. I'm just wondering if that makes sense. How are we balancing that? You know, like when we're aware that there's a higher rate of poverty among our Indigenous students from a variety of perspectives, how do we somehow balance that desire or wanting to, you know, to recognize where they're at, but at the same time provide those opportunities that will help them achieve, you know, maybe the first student that went to university in their family or something like that. So just wanting to have a conversation around that aspect of things.
I'm happy to jump in and kind of join the conversation, and there's a lot to unpack in that question, Trustee Stanley, so thank you for that. The systemic racism of low expectations has been evident in the system for a long time, and there's a lot of layers to it. And one of the things that the ministry did a number of years ago, which is interesting, not necessarily with a solution, but identifying a problem, was we used to have the what was at the time known as the Evergreen graduation, which was called the school leaving certificate. And students used to be able to leave school with a school leaving certificate, which outlined the courses they were successfully completed, and they would take that and move on to their life with employers or future training or whatever. That was in many ways just an opportunity to say this is the end of my schooling and this is where I'm going with it. And the ministry recognized that Indigenous students were overrepresented in evergreen certificates, and so they tightened up the criteria for that and said you have to have a ministry designation, special needs designation, to earn an evergreen, so you can't not have a designation. At the same time, many of our Indigenous families had a mistrust in the education system and were extremely reluctant to have their children in their minds labeled as having a learning disability or something wrong with them. There was a trust issue in the system, and so that resulted in students who were not designated unable to leave school with a school leaving certificate, which was the ministry's response to racism of low expectations, right? The message to the districts was you can't do that anymore. I think a missing piece was the conversation of what Auntie Joan was talking about, which is involving families and communities in defining what success is. And instead of looking at the 80 credit system that we've had, that is a very colonial system, Eurocentric, head off to post-secondary with pre-calculus 12, and that's the right path to go as being the path to success. And I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about the revised curriculum is it's broadened the opportunities for students to take different social studies credits to get to on their pathway. 10 years ago, you couldn't take BC English First Peoples 12 as a graduation requirement, right? It wasn't an option at the time. So I believe the ministry is being responsive to broadening the definition of success. And as you broaden the definition of success and you allow students and families to define success within a system, the conversation will shift, I believe, from how do we have more students, whether they're Indigenous or a group that we've singled out, taking this course versus that course, and the conversation will shift to, are the students meeting their own definitions of success, and are we supporting them to get everything that they can out of their education experience? And that won't happen overnight, but I see it happening. It's been happening in the last several years, and it will continue to happen. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question. But at least get this, and I'll turn it over. I know there's others that want to comment as well.
Scott or anyone on the panel have anything they want to add? Laura?
Thank you, through the chair. Trustee Stanley, you actually, I totally understood what you were trying to ask. I think you asked it in a good way. Like I understand. I think I understand what you were getting at, and Dawn, I think you did a beautiful initial response. So all I wanted to do was add on to your response a little tiny bit, because I guess the first thing that came to mind with your question, Trustee Stanley, was this idea of walking in two worlds. I think that's sort of what you're trying to get at. That we, and what, as an Indigenous person, what I want for my own kids is to be able to, feel rooted and strong as an Indigenous person while they try to navigate this world that is quite Euro-Western. So how do we acknowledge some of those pieces while still giving them dignity, purpose, and options for the reality of the world that we exist in today? And I think that's what you're trying to get at. So I just wanted to sort of mention that walk in two worlds. I think what we also need to do, we're supporting our students and our children to navigate these worlds, is we need to change the world. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean that in making space and having place for Indigenous worldviews. And I think this is what Auntie Joan speaks to all the time. She's talking about this this holistic approach to how we are educating our children. We need to make space and place for that. And it's some of the first step when we can see Superintendent and what he's doing for our district and what he's doing in the province is super unique. And without that leadership in our district, we can't do any of these other things beneath that. So we have the foundation. And some of the pieces that Ricky's talking about in terms of courses, those are some of the small steps that we can take to acknowledge some of those pieces, or having schools like Quamcom, or some of the ways that we're making inroads in that way. But if Auntie Joan is still with us, I think she might have some wise words to share on supporting our Indigenous children with the gifts that they have and who they are as humans, and who they are as little Indigenous people, while still preparing them for the world that we exist in. Thank you for the time.
Absolutely. Auntie?
Thank you, Annie. That's a beautiful question, Jessica, in that when we're walking down this path, it's really, it's so powerful to think about healing the land, because without the land, we won't be able to begin to understand our own individual gifts. And I think that's the unique perspective when we think about honing in on an individual. Without the spiritual integrity that's restored, we don't have a chance. And I think that's the beauty of this approach, is that we're not looking at just the individual, but we're thinking about the context of the collective self. We're thinking about the beauty of the land. And for me, what is really that sense of urgency that we're beginning to walk together. So what's really powerful is that we're thinking about a whole, not only a whole person, but a whole community approach to this, where we can't just rely on one individual. And it's really trying to echo that, you know, Superintendent Sewell is really leading this powerful path in a way that everybody is related. Everybody has an opportunity to say, I have a voice. And I think that's what we're trying to emphasize. It's not just one, but it's all of us. And so I think that if we start thinking about it in that context, which the school district is doing, you'll see, and we always put it this way, you prepare yourself for the extraordinary to happen. And we think about everything that we're touching. You know, even when we presented to VIU, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, right? It's just everybody's thirsty. And I think that's the magic, that we as a family, collective family, is going to stand each of us up individually. That healing that each of us has taken through this journey is unmatched. I can't tell you that, you know, I myself, I wouldn't be where I am today without the magic of the people that are in this circle. Right? It's just, we have our own issues that we've got to power through, because if we don't heal ourselves, how can we help the children? And that's what we're doing, each of us in our respective roles. Doesn't matter who you are, but you've got a place, and we're all paddling in that same direction. It's just profound, so that we're going to get to that chance of helping the individuals thrive. So just a beautiful question, and a beautiful understanding from the team. You know, we all understand our role, and we're all doing the best that we can. So I love each and every one of you. Hi, Tabka.
Absolutely. Stephanie, I see you have a comment on this topic. And Scott, was there something you want to say at some point? Okay.
Thank you for letting me comment on this. I think this is such an interesting conversation when we're trying to talk about creating space, giving students, you know, opportunities, you know, dignity, purpose, and options. Laura, that's, you know, a really good use of that term. And I think about, you know, having students take Math 10 foundations versus workplace and all these things, but still creating this space, the walking together, the walking into world space. And it makes me I go back now to, you know, the colonial construct of the graduation requirements, and also then digging even deeper into more colonial constructs that we have to fight is the funding model. And I think about the recommendation to go from per course to per student funding at the secondary level, and the impact that it would have on this journey, where a student is funded for being a student who walks through our school doors, as opposed to, and all the options and possibilities that come along with that, as opposed to the courses that they choose to take. And I'm not sure that anybody, including myself, has thought about it from the perspective of decolonization and the ability to run a school system in an era of truth and reconciliation, and the impact that it could have on trying to create that system that allows students to walk in two worlds, like you said, Laura. Anyway, I plant the seed for us all to think about whether that is an option, and whether that is something we should advocate for, in terms of, you know, it's sitting somewhere. All those recommendations are sitting somewhere in someone's office, and I don't know if anybody actually ever thought about the power that that particular shift in funding might have. And maybe it's just because I haven't thought it through, and maybe this team can think it through with us further. But I think that it provides, you know, a real opportunity in the context of the conversation we're having when you think about shifting the funding at the secondary level from a per course funding model to a per student funding model. So just a thought.
Anybody have anything they can speak to around that one? I was going to say something about math. Oh, Scott.
Yeah, you know, I wasn't exactly prepared to speak on the recommendations for changing the funding model, but
No.
Trustee Higginson brings up a really good point around the per course funding. Before I say any more, I just want to thank Auntie Joan for being with us here this evening. I think, again, to Trustee Higginson's point, this idea that if we're going to talk about the How Are We Doing report, then there should be nothing about the nation without the nation. And so I'm really glad that Auntie Joan's with us. And just so people know, Ricky did invite our other leaders for learning, and unfortunately they couldn't make it this evening. So around the funding model, I would just say that of all those recommendations, many of them were great. COVID sort of came along and we got a little distracted. But, you know, the prevalence model for funding is one that I also support, and as well as the per course funding model. There's lots to it, and it's a much larger conversation, of course, but there are some really good recommendations in that report.
Thank you. And math to me is a conversation in and of itself. I'm just a little off topic, but I'm going to share a personal experience. I had some medical issues as a child that made me be in and out of school a fair bit in elementary, and in grade 6 in particular, I pretty much was gone the whole year. And I missed some stuff, and math is a really difficult subject when you have gaps. You know, so by the time I hit high school and was trying to learn algebra, there were clearly some things that I missed earlier on, and there was no time or no proper space to, because I was doing well enough, I wasn't failing enough that I really qualified for any kind of special ed, and I hate calling it that, but for lack of a better term, resource, I guess, to fill in those gaps. And I struggled, and I ended up doing the math that you need for university, but I struggled, and it really damaged my education. Like it really gave me a math phobia, and it really kind of kicked my morale where school was concerned. Yeah. So math to me is a huge topic in and of itself. And I see nods, and I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that because we do have time, or if we want to put that in the shelf as a different kind of subject. Seeing no takers, are there other questions from the group? Stephanie has another question. Before I get to Stephanie though, anybody else who hasn't spoken, please get in the chat there and let us know. Let me know so I can get you on a list here. No, okay, go Steph.
Sorry, folks. Can somebody help me in the How Are We Doing report? My math phobia that I experienced in high school is about to be on full display. You know, when it talks about course marks, every subject has the course mark count, and then it has a number under it. Can someone explain to me what that is? Because I'm not sure that I know, but I think I know, and that's dangerous when you're interpreting data.
What page are you on, Stephanie?
Any of them, you know, really any of them, but let's go to Science 10, page 24. It has the school year, then it says course mark count. It has a number.
Yeah, those are the number of students. So if you look at, for example, the 2020-2021, there was 175 students with that course mark that had a C- or better. 95 students as a number that had a C+ or better. And then it has, that's your Aboriginal and your non-Aboriginal. Does that make sense? So those are the number of students.
Okay, so on the question then about, you know, these course marks, what I start to see when I look at these course marks, particularly around the grade 7, is you can start to see already at grade 10, and you touched on this earlier, that we have an overrepresentation of students, of Indigenous students taking workplace math, and we have, you know, an overrepresentation of Indigenous students in the like in courses like that, and then you can see it move through the system. And I wonder, do we, like, as a parent whose child's in the 9th grade and just did their first grade 10, which matters. I think one of you also just talked about the graduation years, and you know, grade 10, 11, and 12 are the graduation years. And actually, we had no idea that my child had done them. And now we're like, what'd you pick? Whatever my friends picked is literally the question. And so, which has resulted in numerous conversations with the school trying to figure it out. So I'm wondering, like, when we see these trends, that I think we can then sort of play all the way through the system and see them playing themselves out a little bit in our adult Dogwood graduate rates and stuff. You know, what do we do with that information? What are we doing with it now? And what I appreciate is that my hope is that all the stuff that we're talking about with Auntie Joan is that, you know, this is we're playing the long game. Despite the use of urgency, we're playing the long game on this, and that's the right long game. It's the right one. And I'm, you know, with every fiber of my being, know that it's going to have good results for all the students, but most importantly for our Indigenous students. But we also have the right now students. And so what are we doing to try to help make sure that we can reverse those trends of having Indigenous students overrepresented in, you know, workplace programs or alternate programs?
It's a big question. I'll get us started on that. And it's wrapped up in a whole bunch of things, right? We have a colonial system where we're saying to our Indigenous learners, pre-calculus 10, 11, and 12 is what you need to take. We're defining that for them as being we want more Indigenous learners to take that class, and that's a very colonial Eurocentric mindset. So I shift to a decolonizing. If students find themselves in the curriculum, find themselves in schooling, find themselves their culture, their connection to the land, their connection to the community in the system, they'll succeed in anything and everything they want to. And we need to support the learner first before we ask the question, what's wrong with the learner? What do we need to do to the learner to have them be more successful? So that's a long game answer. The short game answer is, Ricky touched on graduation program readiness. There's a transition from grade 9 to grade 10. We have this beautiful K-9 standard-based assessment process that all of our students have gone through, and we have work to do with our staff around what does it look like, because they have a very content-based assessment practices historically in the graduation program, and it's a shift for students, and we need to prepare teachers and give them the resources and professional learning support to say, hey, if a learner comes into the graduation program and they've had a standard-based assessment process and they've had a lot of formative feedback throughout the system, are we meeting that learner where they're ready? That's the first question. And then a lot of it is math in particular is the subject we're talking about. There's a lot of math readiness work to be done in the system, and it's Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners. There are many students who end up in a stream of math that's not necessarily best for them to make decisions when they're 14, turning 15, that will impact them going forward. So math is a pinch point. As Ricky said, Science 10 has been, since the 2004 graduation program came in, been a very content-heavy, difficult course, and is often the first course that students, Indigenous or non-Indigenous students, find as a barrier to being on the pathway to graduation. So we do need to identify courses and identify opportunities to support our adults in the system to be ready for those learners, so that every single one of them that has an interest and that's the right pathway for them is able to be successful.
And I'll just add too that there is talk at the ministry around creating Science First Peoples 10. And so I think that will help. But in the meantime, yeah, really working with, had initial conversations with Shelley Gavoyich, one of our coordinators, around, you know, how can we work with science teachers and decolonizing that curriculum, because it is the math and the science and I mean the content, but also the ways in which we teach it are just historically very colonial. So yeah, we're working on it. And I was going to say something else too. And around Learning Alt, I think that, have you been there? Because if you go there, you want to be there. And I think for many of our students that land there, learning alternatives, the environment there just represents that, you know, it feels different. It sounds different. It looks different. And I think that that type of learning environment, you know, our kids are drawn to that, right? And I think with the numbers increasing over there and all of the programs that's been created over there, I think now's the time that we need to start learning from them and taking, how can we create Learning Alt type environments in our traditional schools to help students who thrive in those environments. So.
Ricky, I couldn't agree with you more. I actually think that our Learning Alt program is what the learning transformation was intended to be. And I think we should be really, really proud of it, for sure. And I would love that conversation. Like, what does it look like to make every school look like that, where students are recognized for, well, they're known for, like, they're known. Every student in that program is known. And I think that's so critical. So I think that's, I really love that program, and I think we have a lot to learn from it. I like the way you put it. So thank you.
Absolutely. I have to echo that. I have been in the Learning Alt program, and it's exciting, amazing work. I wish I'd had something like that when I was in high school. Yeah.
If I could just add through you, Chair, I was there today, so I fully appreciate the staff there and the great work they're doing and improving outcomes for sure. Really hard to duplicate though in the regular system because we'd have to double the staffing at least in every single school and double the space. And so that's a challenging proposition to say the least. So, well, they have, in my estimation, the best learning alternatives program. I can't imagine a better learning alternatives program in the province. It's as good as it gets. Hard to replicate. So,
absolutely.
I think that we shouldn't let that stop us. I think there are so many things in that program that we don't want to replicate, but we want to learn from and infuse into every school in the district. And it's not just about staffing levels, it's about attitude, and it's about a deep dedication to the students. And I'm not saying that every staff member in our district doesn't have that, because they do. We're so fortunate with the staff in every position in this district. But well, parts of it are impossible. I think there's a lot of it that we could actually infuse into every school in the district. It's a beautiful program, and I can understand why a lot of students want to be there and thrive there. I just totally see it. I do think, though, we have to be really conscious and cognizant of making sure that while Learning Alt is an amazing place, and every school is an amazing place, so I'm trying to be really careful how I choose my words so that I don't upset folks, but just making sure that it's not sort of like Learning Alt's a better place for you. And that's something that just because it's a really amazing program doesn't mean that I want other folks to think that they don't have the responsibility to meet the students' needs in the buildings that they're in.
Well said. And I see that Jessica has a comment. And then Steffi, I see you have another question, but I want to get some other comments in.
I have my hand over my mouth because it's kind of like what Stephanie just said. I just want to acknowledge that. I mean, I love Learning Alt, but let's face it, kids end up there because they're not successful in the regular system for whatever reasons. So I think that aspect of the conversation may not need to happen now, but I think it's a really important aspect, which is, why aren't they succeeding? and that's the lessons that maybe we can pull over. I just it's not an insult on learning alt. It's just more like, you know, hey, what can we learn from it? So thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you have any other question while you're on? No, she's gone. Steph, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks. So I just want to unpack some of the more crunchy parts of this conversation. I hear when I'm reading our our How Are We Doing report, I hear Deb Jeffries over my shoulder giving lots of pointers, as she does at lots of our learning events. And I do want to talk a little bit about the increase in adult dogwoods and help me understand why we've seen a significant increase, I think. And like I said, the numbers, when I look at numbers, I get a little like vertigo-y. So I may be interpreting the information incorrectly, but when I look at the actual page and I look at the numbers increasing from 2016 to 2021, and then it was commented on in the presentation. So just help me understand that and help me understand how I explain that to someone like Deb Jeffries or a family who reads this data and says, hey, your grad rates actually aren't, you know, 80%, because 15% of it is in adult dogwoods. They're 65%. So how do we reconcile that to folks?
I'll start that conversation as well and let others kind of jump in. So yeah, in that conversation, if somebody says, hey, how is your graduation rate, 6-year completion rate, what's the composite of it? And I would say, well, some of it is the BC Dogwood, some of it is the adult Dogwood diploma, and some of it's our evergreen students who have completed. And you can break it out. And I would look for the response from that 5-year trend to say, are we trending up? So if you remove the adult Dogwood students, is our completion rate going down? In other words, are we replacing a student who may have graduated with a Dogwood with someone with an adult Dogwood? And our data suggests otherwise. Our data suggests that we are increasing the percentage of students who are graduating with a BC Dogwood certificate. We're also increasing the percentage of students that are graduating with an adult Dogwood. So I would argue that we're still trending upwards in all of those categories. Brings the conversation back to what value do we place on an adult Dogwood, and I caution that, you know, we shouldn't be devaluing an adult Dogwood. And I look at the adult Dogwoods, and our school principals look at it because they get the data on who those individuals are, and there's an individual story, and within that story, there may be cause for concern. It may be the story, maybe we could have done better, and that student was on a path to a regular Dogwood, and the school didn't do its part. Many of those stories are huge success stories. Someone's life went completely sideways for a number of years, and instead of being a non-graduate and leaving school at grade 8 and never returning to the school system, they returned at 17 or 18 or 19 years old and completed with an adult Dogwood, and now we're off to some post-secondary or on-the-job training, and we celebrate that to the moon and back. So I don't look at that number as necessarily cautionary until you look at the individual stories, and the vast majority of our adult Dogwood completions are huge success stories. It's the ones where the school looks and says, we're concerned, we think we could have done better by that student and by that family. And so yeah, there's always work to be done, but the overall trend is we're increasing in both categories. We're not replacing ones. We're not decreasing in our diploma, in our Dogwood, by replacing them with adult diplomas, if that makes sense.
I think it does. Do you have a follow-up, Trustee Higginson?
No, I'd like to see, to your point though, I would like to see that number of on adult Dogwoods trending down. I think that's something that we can over time feel more celebratory about, rather than having them both trend up. And I think that's an important question for us to talk to ourselves about. You know, how do we make sure that we're trending in the right direction on these, not in the wrong direction? So I see Tim had a comment though.
Yeah, and that, but I see Auntie also is. Auntie,
Oh yeah, I think he's up there.
Auntie, did you want to speak?
No,
And then we'll
thank
go
you.
to Tim
And
and Scott.
sorry, thank you.
No,
And
I
I
was you
think,
first, Auntie, and then Tim, and then Scott.
yeah, thank you. And I think those, that perspective is important. I think it goes back to, in my mind, is how do we define that success, right? And it's just, for me, it's at every touch point, we have to really dive in a little deeper and really recognize how our students are coming out, and what are the parents and the community thinking is what is needed. From my lens, when I was young, they looked at me and said, this is what you're going to do in your life. So, we all have different perspectives, we have different responsibilities. I think if we dive in a little deeper, is what is it that you're intended to do to bring and contribute to the community as a whole? So sometimes it's math, sometimes it's something very different. So I think that's really important, to Dawn's point, that we have to really understand the individual stories. And I get fearful that we start diving in on those numbers without really telling the whole story. And that's why I always say our story is really unique, that most people will never understand, that they'll think we don't have the numbers. Yeah, but look at how we're thriving together as a family. I think that's really powerful, in creating that space for us to learn and what is important to the community. And I think, to Scott's point, that the community needs to be here to answer those questions. So make sure that we understand. Some people that, of course, I won't talk about my math, because it wasn't a pretty story. But really, at the end of the day, I think it's a family approach, and that's what I love about this conversation, that we all have an idea and a way of, and that way from the old people, it's going to take all of us to contribute to what can this tell us, these numbers tell us. Is it a real story? I don't know. So thank you for that. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Tim?
Madam Chair, thank you. Just wanted to extend, I guess, off of Auntie Joan and Dawn's comments here, and I love the fact that we're actually getting down to the individual student in terms of our recognition and conversation here. I'm going to take this back to Learning Alternatives days, and my credit to Superintendent Squale for what he started with in our district here. I know alternate schooling was here probably for years and years prior to a change, but learning alternatives was something new back in the day that Superintendent brought this to our district here. And it really was about knowing the story for the individual student. And my response to the question is, and this again ties back to learning alternatives, but are we improving the life chances for our students? And I think that's the question that we need to ask as we're examining the story and helping our students to move forward in their success. So, thank you.
Absolutely. And Scott, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I heard Trustee Higginson say earlier something about playing the long game, but which led into I think this question about, okay, so what are we doing today? And it was Justice Marie Sinclair that said something like, it took us 7 generations to get here. And because it took us so long to get here, so many generations that got us to this point, it's going to take us a little while to get out of it. And I think he says something like there are no easy solutions to this issue. Talking about the Idle Dogwood, you won't be surprised that not one of those students, either Indigenous or non-Indigenous, come from a high socioeconomic situation. And most of those students live in a low socioeconomic situation and or have some other vulnerability, like have a unique need as well. And so there's another thing, the ministry changed the rules around the adult dogwood not so long ago, and they reduced it from 19 to 18 and really actively promoted it as a good thing for students. I still think it's a really good thing for students because each one of those students has a story of success, and it might be that they were the first person to graduate in their family. And we've often said in learning alternatives programs, sometimes success is just getting a student to school. And so graduation is beyond imaginable for some. An adult graduation is beyond imaginable. Our hope is that every student has a full complement of courses and experiences when they graduate, but that's not the case. And that's what we're always working towards. So thank you for the question, because it's a good one to ask. And we're not, trying to defend it, believe me, because we can always do better, for certain.
I think I'm going to start to wrap up here, even though we've got a few more minutes. Steph, no, it's okay. Did you want to add something?
I just want to add something in.
Yes, please, of course.
Like my reflection of looking at all this data today, if it's okay.
Yeah.
So I think, I always think it's really important for us to look. I really appreciate the way we've sort of embedded student stories into the conversations about numbers. And I think those are critical stories to tell and critical touch points for us to remember as we sit, like I said at the beginning, at this table, this virtual table, looking at numbers. I also think it's really important for us every year as people who oversee the system in our role of trustees to look at these numbers and to talk about this stuff that we talked about today. Why are we seeing an overrepresentation of students taking workplace math versus foundations? Why are we seeing overrepresentations of certain students? And then for us to look at those, what we want to see is those small incremental gains over time. And if we're not looking at them and we're not looking at the numbers, then we don't have the opportunity to see those small incremental gains over time, and also to define for ourselves what a small incremental gain is. My hope, though, is that, Ricky, you started off at the beginning by saying, when we see such a big jump like we saw this year, we really want to understand it. And you attributed it to a number of things. And my hope is that that those things become embedded practice, that we see those at the budget table or at the budget discussions when we're having them, we see ourselves directing resources to those things that are working. And I'm looking forward to the conversation where you guys come to us during budget time and say this worked. And my hope is also that in 10 years we see that that's become an embedded practice because we know it works. So thank you for the conversation today. I think it's really critical for us to have sometimes these hard conversations and look at these numbers that are a little bit crunchy, but also to hear the stories that are woven through it. And I'm really appreciative of all the staff in the district for all the efforts they put into ensuring success, and also to Auntie Joan for being here to help us, start having these conversations in a different way. So thanks to everyone for indulging my 8 million questions tonight.
Thank you. And I just want to raise my hands to the team for your work. Such a thorough and interesting presentation and easy to understand. I want to hi Tabka to all of you and raise my hands to you, Auntie Joan, and thank you for being here tonight. It's been a great evening. I've learned a lot, and I just think that we're on a good path here. We're working in a good way, and I just want to see us build and continue to grow together and support our kids. So given that, we have no correspondence and no unfinished business. We have no new business. So I would like to seek a motion to adjourn. Somebody, there we go. Thank you, Jessica and Steph. So is there anyone opposed to an adjournment? Okay, seeing no objections, I'm going to call the meeting adjourned for tonight, the education meeting adjourned. Reminder to trustees that we have our business committee meeting at 6 o'clock. So we will see you all in 15 minutes, and Greg will be chairing. Time to get a stretch and give staff a chance to get a break, quick rest. So thank you very much, and we'll be back in 15.